Good evening. I'm John Dankosky of the Connecticut Mirror. Our event is presented by the Mirror and by the Connecticut Foundation for Open Government, otherwise known as CFOG. Our event is called Regulating Big Tech, the Limits of Free Speech on Social Media. I want to thank, first of all, Bruce Putterman and Courtney Gavitt from the Connecticut Mirror, and Bill Fish, Mitchell Perlman, Dennis Horgan, Len Bestoff, Marie Shanahan, Matthew Kaufman, and Kate Farish from CFOG for helping to put this program together. This program is being recorded for both our Connecticut Mirror YouTube channel, where you can find past events at ctmirror.org/events, and it's also being recorded for our podcast, Steady Habits. You've got a few ways you can interact with us and ask questions tonight. There's a chat field where you can share thoughts and ideas with others taking part in the program. And if you have a question specifically for our panelists, please put it in the Q&A field at the bottom of your screen. Now, we won't likely get to all of your questions, but we hope to get to many of them. So what are we talking about tonight? Officials across the political spectrum have taken aim at Section 230, the federal law that holds social media companies harmless for the content posted by their users. It's said to be the backbone of the modern internet, the legal framework that allows for free exchange of ideas. It's even been called better than the First Amendment by one of our guests tonight. Of course, Section 230 also shields these giant companies from responsibility when lies, defamation, and even threats are posted. The companies do get to set and enforce their own rules of speech, and that includes, in the highest profile example to date, banning former President Donald Trump. Trump and many conservatives want Section 230 thrown out, saying it allows internet platforms to limit conservative speech. Meanwhile, some Democrats, including some in the Biden administration, have taken aim at the law, wanting to hold internet companies accountable for hate speech that causes violence. So what would it mean to change Section 230, to amend it in a way that works better for more Americans? My guests are three leading thinkers, writers, and teachers on the subject. Let me welcome them in. Eric Goldman is a professor of law at Santa Clara University School of Law and co-director of the High Tech Law Institute. Anupam Chander is professor of law at Georgetown University's Law Center, who studies global regulation of new technologies and is author of The Electronic Silk Road. And Daphne Keller is another graduate of Yale Law School, a former associate general counsel for Google. She directs the program on platform regulation at Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center. I want to welcome you all to our program. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So let's start by just getting a little bit of a framework here. And there's a few foundational questions. And maybe I'll go to Eric Goldman first. For people who don't follow this every day, what exactly is Section 230? Maybe you can explain it.
Yeah, Section 230 is a statute that Congress enacted in 1996 that basically says, to summarize it really simply, websites are liable for third-party content. And it's a really simple allocation of liability principle, so that somebody is going to originate content and they're going to share it on the internet. And then the other people who might be helping disseminate or distribute that content aren't liable for it, but the person who originated is. So it creates this clean division between the first party who's accountable and the other parties who are not.
Okay, so Daphne, what else would you like to add to that description? I mean, what else do we need to know about Section 230 in the way that it affects our lives every day?
Sure. Well, one piece of CDA 230 that gets a lot of attention is this immunity for many kinds of claims involving unlawful speech posted by users. It doesn't immunize platforms for every claim. It doesn't immunize them for federal criminal claims or for copyright, some other things like that. But another piece of it, and this is the one that lately has had the most attention from Republicans, is both the goal of the platform's drafters and the provisions in the statute that say platforms are allowed to go out and moderate content. They do get to decide when lawful speech is still prohibited because it is bullying or it is hate speech, which for the most part is legal in this country, or scams. And without that freedom for platforms to go out and take down the things that violate their rules, we would see a very, very different internet. You know, we would see a cesspool of a bunch of content that most of us don't want to see at all. Now, 230 is not the only basis of platforms' rights to do that, but it is the cleanest and most straightforward one that gives them, you know, a pretty high degree of legal certainty that they can go ahead and enforce their rules.
Anupam, I'll go to you next. I mean, what else do you think from your world that we need to know about this that's vitally important as we enter into this conversation?
So, I just think Eric and Daphne have explained it really well. And to add to their description, 230 is the architectural law of the internet that we have today. It is what makes the kind of internet that we have today possible. Zoom, the platform that we are currently speaking on, relies upon 230. Why? Because lots and lots of people do terrible things via Zoom. In no case is Zoom liable for it unless it developed that content, unless it was in some way shaping that content, controlling that content. And so not just because it disseminated that content or because it knew about that content. So that is a critical feature of the internet that we have today. So I have a paper called How Law Made Silicon Valley. And this is one of the critical laws that made Silicon Valley today, and what, for good and for ill. And so many people complain about not just the content moderation. So Daphne pointed to the fact that some people now complain that their speech is being squelched by as identified as hate speech or false or misinformation by these platforms. That is a provision in 230 that really immunizes their editorial function. This is a critical feature of 230. But there's also people who say 230 doesn't provide enough responsibility by the platforms. So there's critiques from the right and the left. So 230 is a much unloved law in Washington today. And it has critics from the right and the left, and the critics have the exact opposite arguments about 230. It licenses too much bad speech, or that too much of my speech is being silenced. So both those concerns are being voiced right now in the halls of Congress. And it will be interesting to see whether or not Congress can move forward and reconcile those different complaints that tug in different directions. So we'll see what happens.
And I want to get into some of those in just a little bit, but maybe I can just pick up on something that you said there. A distinction, of course, is that the internet providers are not held liable unless they are shaping the content. Those are the words that you use. Unless they're making the content themselves. But taking Zoom as the example that you just used, Zoom shapes the content every day because of the platform itself that they've provided. We do certain things on Zoom that we don't do anywhere else. I mean, just looking at the screens right now, two of you have filters on behind you that Zoom provides. Zoom is an entire new language of the way in which we do things. Isn't it true that just the platform design itself is a way that it's shaping people's content?
I think that's a great and very interesting observation. You are right that editing is happening all the time. And you as a publisher, you guys as publishers and editors recognize the fact that editing is happening all the time. The question is whether or not that editing becomes development of the content itself. And here, I think Zoom, even if it's providing filters that are themselves the offending filters that really are that violate other people's rights, yes, then it is liable. But for this kind of Zoom background that I have or that Eric has, Eric actually, there could be a potential violation in Eric's background, so just FYI. So even here, there is a possibility, and that's actually not a 230 question, that's a DMCA question, a second law that is an architectural law of the internet. But anyway, there's a lot of important laws that really have made possible the internet as we see today. And when we start modifying those laws in dramatic fashion, it's going to reshape the internet in ways that are often unexpected.
So,
can I talk about Eric's backdrop more for a second?
Yes, please do.
Because I think it's a really great illustration of part of the problem. If you give intermediaries the job of deciding what violates the law and what doesn't, they are going to be risk averse. And we have lots and lots of empirical data showing this tendency to be risk averse and to look at something like someone's very talented child's drawing of Yoda, for example, Baby Yoda, and say, that makes me uncomfortable. I'm going to take it down so that I don't face liability. Whereas if it were up to Eric, he would fight for the fair use status of Baby Yoda. And that dynamic, putting the liability on platforms or the legal judgment about things they're not very motivated to leave up, and they don't want to invest the money to really decide or to face litigation for leaving it up, it is part of the problem once you step outside of the world of CDA 230. In systems where platforms get notified of allegations that things break the law, you also get a real heckler's veto problem. You get people trying to leverage that to silence their enemies or their critics. So there are famous examples of things like the government of Ecuador using fake copyright claims to get rid of critical news reporting and videos of police brutality, instances of politicians and corporations and, all kinds of bad actors sending fraudulent notices in order to silence content. This is one of the things that 230 gets us away from within the US legal system.
Eric, would you like to pick up on that, either on the Baby Yoda front or the substance of Daphne's Daphne's comment?
And so two things. First of all, one of my great joys in life is when other smart people speculate about my potential legal liability on a national oriented broadcast like this. So this has been a fun conversation for me. I will point out that this is indeed fan art that my daughter painted for me, not provided by Zoom. And so if there is any legal accountability, I or my daughter should be accountable for it. But I'm willing to take that risk, as Daphne pointed out, because I don't think it's a risk at all. And it's so cute. I mean, come on. But in terms of the incentives problem, there really is some interesting problems when we think about how willing are internet services to put money behind third-party content, either to prospectively review it up front or to defend it after the fact. And the reality is that any particular item of content usually isn't worth the money either to defend it after the fact or even to review it up front. And so to the extent that we think about this as a financial equation, an economic decision, we have to think about what's in the best interest of the services when they're faced with low value. And I think my daughter's fan art is beautiful, but they don't care enough about it. It's not making them enough money. Low value content to them, what are they going to do? The answer is quite easy. Daphne explained, over removals will ensue. One last thing I just want to mention is we were talking about Zoom's liability, and with respect to Zoom, notice that essentially they're enabling live streaming. And live streaming is a particularly difficult case because the internet services enabling live streaming can't really find out about a problem until after the fact, and it's only if they're monitoring in real time. And so if we establish legal liability for people who enable live streaming, they can't really manage that legal liability. And we're really, I think, concluding we just don't think live streaming should be enabled online.
I want to get back to the statement that you've made, Eric, that I referenced at the start of the program, that Section 230 is better than the First Amendment. Make the case for us.
So both of them are designed to advance free speech. Now, we could stop right there and say, we're not a big fan of free speech. And then sadly, we're seeing so many people in our country say, no, we actually don't care about free speech as much as maybe other people do. But if we value free speech, the First Amendment sets a legal baseline, a minimum amount of free speech that must take place in our society that Congress or other legislatures or other government entities can't take away. Section 230 adds to that. It supplements that baseline to say, we think that there's value if we enable more free speech than the First Amendment enables. And so one of the ways it's better is that it enables this extra zone of protection for free speech be above and beyond the constitutional limits, for reasons we hope that by enabling the extra free speech, we get social benefits. And I'm happy to make that case more if you want. The other way it's better than the First Amendment is that it takes courts out of the business of trying to adjudicate the Constitution, something they really don't like to do, because if they say something's unconstitutional, the legislatures lose the power to fix it. So by allowing courts to rely on Section 230 as a statute, what it does is it enables them to say, I can make this decision and know that I'm not locking in legislatures forevermore in this decision. And that also enables them to rule earlier in the case than they might otherwise rule. If it's a constitutional question, they're going to want to make sure they get all the facts necessary to make sure they got that decision exactly right. But with Section 230, the way it's structured enables decisions to be made earlier in the litigation process. What that does is it lowers the cost of defense for internet services. We just talked about they're cost sensitive, that any individual item of content isn't valuable enough for them to spend a lot of money defending it. By lowering the cost of defense and by increasing the certainty that they'll have protection, it actually enables internet services to make the decision they're going to stand behind their users' content, which they might not make under the First Amendment, even if the First Amendment would guarantee the same outcome, because it would cost them more to make that decision.
Daphne, I'm wondering if you can comment on that argument, and if you feel as though that argument that Eric makes holds up in whole or in part.
Well, I am particularly persuaded by the part about costs. Basically, I think there are a lot of people from newspaper backgrounds here who know that winning a First Amendment case, that's expensive. That is slow and expensive and sometimes risky. Whereas CDA 230 just short circuits that and creates a mechanism to win those cases quickly. Now, that has pros and that has cons, right? To the extent that the consequence is that speech that's actually illegal remains online, I think most people would say that's a bad thing, depending what you think of the particular law. On the other hand, a lot of the function of CDA 230 is to encourage platforms to go out and try to take down that speech without fearing that they're going to create more liability for themselves in doing so. I think there was an interesting study that came out recently from the Internet Association, which is a trade association, but I think they did a good job vetting the CDA 230 cases, showing just what a huge portion of them were cases that also failed on the merits. The court said this platform's immunized by 230, but also your claim is not legitimate in the first place. So I think that gives us a snapshot of the kinds of non-meritorious claims that are being affected. Another important finding of that study, and something that I think is missing from a lot of the public discussion, is CDA 230 is being used by lots of little tiny defendants you've never heard of. We make a big mistake in the public discussion, but more so in legislation, if we assume the world is made up of Facebook and Google and Twitter, and we draft new laws based on their capabilities, what they can afford to do, what tools they can afford to build, and then we apply that willy-nilly to any newspaper that allows user comments, any retailer that allows comments about sweaters or widgets, to my elementary school kids' blog. There's just this very wide array of other companies and other kinds of actors in the economy and in American public discourse who are absolutely depending on CDA 230, but who don't get considered in the political discussion.
And Anupam, I know that you've talked about this. Maybe you can pick up on this.
Yeah, so I think that Daphne's point is incredibly important, and I just want to reiterate it just so that people get it. It's just worth kind of emphasizing again and again. When Congress and legislatures across the world think about internet regulation, they often have Google, Facebook, Amazon, and maybe Microsoft and Apple in mind. And maybe Twitter as well. Daphne mentioned Twitter. And that's not the way to regulate the internet. The internet is much bigger than all of those. There's so many more companies. When we started a few minutes before, Bruce shared, the publisher of the Connecticut Mirror, shared his screen. And I could see the tabs that he had open. Among those tabs were MailChimp, there were Salesforce, a host of other companies, all of which live and die on the basis of 230. That is, they are circulating and sharing information provided by other people. And if they were held liable for at each time, they would no longer be able to provide that service. I mean, it's literally existential. So when people say that this is the law that made the internet, much of the internet literally disappears if 230 isn't preserved, because the liability for circulating an email without having a team that vets it beforehand, a publishing team, like what publishers do before they publish because of defamation, is really very, very is so high as to be disabling. And as Daphne says, this is a law that has been relied upon by newspapers, the Orange County Register, small newspapers in Illinois, because bloggers across the country who rely upon 230 again and again, because when you have a comment site, when you allow someone to comment on your website, it protects user sites that do user reviews. So I don't know about you, but I do a lot of shopping now online, and I often rely upon user reviews of restaurants or products, and those are full of disinformation. And if the user review site were liable for that disinformation, it couldn't provide anything but a 5-star review, which would then make that user review site useless. Because if you're comparing 5-star, you would just count up the number of 5-star reviews as opposed to actually getting honest information.
So then, isn't one of the biggest questions, though, about allowing us to have more transparency into the systems that internet companies are using to moderate speech, to actually enforce the rules that they and they alone are able to set down? If we knew more about how these things worked, it would be, I think, a lot easier, but it's very hard for us to understand the rules that companies are applying to make these decisions about what speech is good and what speech isn't. I'm not sure who wants to jump in on that, but I think it's an important piece.
I think we're all going to want to jump in on that.
Go for it.
But I actually would like to go
Right.
second. So I would like to hear what Daphne or Anupam want to say about that. But I do want to speak on this one.
So I have been a big advocate of better transparency from big platforms about their content moderation practices for years. I think, one of the reasons is because of the need to, the public's very legitimate desire to understand what is being done by, again, the biggest platforms, the ones that could be considered gatekeepers for public discourse, the ones that have this huge role in our society, and what information we see. But the other benefit to better transparency that I see is frankly to help educate lawmakers, to avoid an outcome where lawmakers assume, oh, platforms could easily identify which content is legal and which content is illegal if they just tried. To have transparency into what goes on in reality and demonstrate, nope, actually they make a whole lot of mistakes, and the mistakes, consistently err on the side of over removal. Also, there's a growing body of data, although we can't really know because we don't have enough of it, but there's a growing body of data suggesting that when platforms make mistakes, they disparately impact certain people. There's a hate speech filter, so-called hate speech filter that academic group studied that was penalizing African-American English 50% more than other kinds of speakers of American English with accidental hate speech designations. So it's not just a speech issue, it's a matter of who accidentally gets excluded from participation on the internet generally. Is that a disparate impact? How does that impact the economy? It's a very large set of questions, and we can't legislate intelligently without much better public understanding of what that collateral damage might look like and what mechanisms to contain that collateral damage might look like. Now, there are in fact drawbacks to transparency, and I wonder if either of the other panelists are going to talk about them, one of which is it could be a First Amendment violation. This is not my favorite First Amendment argument, but it has been successfully argued that transparency requirements can be a form of compelled speech that the government doesn't have the right to require. So there is a big lurking First Amendment question there. And I will pause there because I know everyone wants to talk about transparency.
Eric, go ahead.
So who doesn't want more transparency? This is like a human nature. Tell us more. Give us a choice. That will help us make decisions. That will inform enforcement actions and so on. But let's be candid. We normally don't know the editorial decision making that takes place at most editorial organizations. And I'm just going to pick one, for example, the Connecticut Mirror. I don't actually know very much about how the Connecticut Mirror prioritizes stories, how many words it chooses to invest in a particular story, what stories it decides to kill and not cover whatsoever, and how the stories are promoted or prioritized. And I'm okay with all of that. That's actually the standard by which we operate in our society. We don't know about this information. Now, it is possible the reason why we'll never know is because of the First Amendment that Daphne mentioned. And I actually think that's a very cogent consideration. Could Congress or a state legislature tell Connecticut Mirror, you got to make all that transparent to us. You got to tell us how you prioritize your editorial resource. You got to tell us what stories you killed and why you killed them. You got to tell us how you decided which stories got a higher promotion on the website versus the others. I'm guessing you would be pretty unhappy about that. And you might very well say, that's an intrusion into our editorial process. But even if it's not a First Amendment problem, I think we really need to ask a hard-to-hard question. Do we need that in order to understand editorial platforms or publishers? Do we need to understand how they run their editorial function in order to evaluate whether or not they're a useful resource for us? And I think the short answer is we've gone without that for millennia, and I think we're going to continue to go just fine without it now.
Anupam?
So there, I might suggest that, I'm a huge fan of Eric's work. There might be some reason to, and whether it's done through legislation or by pressure from outside groups, I'm not sure, but there is reason to worry, of course, as I'm sure Eric would worry about the power that these very large platforms have over our speech environment. Now, I don't think it's, I want to make sure that I don't think that it is a monopoly of power between YouTube and Twitter or Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. There's a lot of other platforms out there. My kids, are on TikTok. My son is on Discord. Everyone reads Reddit, et cetera, et cetera. The Nextdoor is a platform that people use. So there's just a host of different platforms. But at the same time, I think it is incumbent on the largest platforms to make it available for us to be able to evaluate whether or not they are skewing things in one direction or another. So that is, I would like, so Eric is 100% right. We haven't had this capacity in the past. We've lived for millennia without it. But I don't see any reason that we couldn't improve our access to this information in this next millennium. And so I think that the platforms are feeling some pressure on opening up access. But of course, there's also privacy issues, which they have to worry about at the same time, because once they start telling us who is tweeting what to when, whom at what time, that becomes, really, it has a lot of baggage associated with it. And the Cambridge Analytica mess came out of their Facebook's early sharing of data with researchers. So Facebook is once burned, twice shy in this area.
Hey, John, can I just amend or supplement just a quick remark to Anupam's points, which I generally agree with. But I just want to add that the major internet companies have done a lot to provide transparency into this process, much more than traditional media have ever provided, even when they were dominant players. Think back to the old newspapers that were local monopolies, for example. They never provided the kind of transparency that the internet companies provide today. And as long as they're doing it voluntarily, I'm all for it. I think that's fantastic. When the government mandates it, though, now I have a really big question. Can you do that? And why are you doing it here, knowing that we would probably push back very hard for the same kinds of requests in other media?
And I'm sorry, Daphne, had you wanted to jump in?
I might take us a little off topic.
You can go off topic.
Okay. This is following up in part on something Anupam said. It just seems like a good opportunity to flag that issues in this space that appear to be very partisan are, in fact, I think, not as partisan as the DC conversation makes it appear. So I'm sure if we watch tomorrow's hearing, in which yet again tech CEOs are being grilled about online content and their responsibility for it, we will see broadly Republicans saying, why are you taking down so much? Stop it, you're interfering with free speech. And Democrats saying, why don't you take down more? You are promoting, harmful disinformation and hate speech. But really, I think lots of people across the political spectrum want platforms to take down lawful but harmful speech. There is a lot of stuff out there that nobody wants to see, but that is First Amendment protected, including really bad stuff. Like the Christchurch massacre video is in many cases lawful to share, and yet you saw consensus across the political spectrum that platforms should hurry up and take it down. So this desire to silence some lawful speech is not actually a left-right issue. It's a society-wide issue. Similarly, the concern that big companies that get to moderate online speech in some of the most important forums for discussion and communication, the concern that they might have political bias and that they might be putting a thumb on the scales, right now that is surfacing as a concern more from Republicans, but there's nothing innately Republican about that fear. That is also something that anyone across the political spectrum can get on board with. So, I think there are really hard questions here, and we don't do ourselves any favors by accepting a political framing that says, here's the left-wing view and here's the right-wing view.
We're getting a lot of questions from people in the Q&A field, and if you want to put a question in there, it's just at the bottom of the screen. It's a very nice thing that Zoom has worked out for us here, that we can just put a question in there and get it to our panelists. Mitchell Perlman asks,
and thank you, Section 230, for that, just to note how much we appreciate that.
I knew you might want to get that in. Mitchell Perlman asks, should platforms such as Facebook be liable for speech that they amplify by high-level placement on their platforms? I think it gets to the high-level placement piece of it. I think a lot of people who are in the organizations that I'm working with and working for, who are newspaper people, hear you, Eric, say the newspapers never gave us this much transparency. Newspapers don't have to tell us how they work. But the traditional way in which newspapers work isn't we put up some speech higher and leave it up there because we're getting paid more for it and it makes us more money along the way. That was never part of the plan. And I think what Mitch and many other people are asking is, doesn't this somehow make, say, Facebook different than the newspaper model that you were referring to earlier?
And I'm sorry, I'm a little bit unclear, because when you talk about being paid to put it higher, we might be talking about advertising. We could also be talking about editorial decisions to amplify content. And I have some thoughts about that, but actually this is a project of Daphne's for over a year, so I would want to defer to her first.
Yeah, I'll just say, and I think that they're both applicable, so we can attack both things. But go ahead, Daphne.
Sure. So to the extent that we're talking about content that gets amplified via recommendations or ranking on a news feed, for example, I think, first of all, much of the content that people are concerned with is for better or for worse legal and First Amendment protected. So changing CDA 230 would not create immunity for platforms for, vast swaths of electoral or medical disinformation, hate speech, like lots of really bad stuff. That's just not something 230 gets to change or Congress gets to change. I think there's also an assumption that Congress can be more aggressive in mandating or accidentally causing a bunch of removal of lawful speech if they're targeting amplification features versus underlying hosting. And that, I think, is just not the case. Like, there's strong, consistent Supreme Court precedent saying when Congress merely burdens speech, meaning reduces its distribution, that raises the exact same First Amendment questions as if it had actually banned that same speech. So I think that area is complicated. On advertisement, I don't know if, Anupam, were you going to jump in and talk about New York Times versus Sullivan? Because so here's my favorite intermediary liability case. You may know it as a newspaper case. New York Times versus Sullivan set the standard for newspaper liability for defamation, saying unless they knew or were in reckless disregard of the falsity of the content, they couldn't, the newspaper, the New York Times, could not be liable for it. People tend to assume this is a case about an article that they ran, but it was not. It was about an advertisement run by civil rights activists in Alabama, calling attention to things that Alabama state employees had done to suppress African-American activists trying to protect their rights. And the court made this really clear in the opinion, saying people who don't own printing presses need an avenue to place ads or to post their content on an intermediary, which is exactly what happened here. And we don't want to place such a burden of liability on the intermediary that it silences those people.
And in New York Times v. Sullivan, Daphne, as Daphne would point out further to pursue that important point, New York Times got paid thousands of dollars to run this ad. And the argument from Mr. Sullivan was the ad had falsity in it. It had false claims about Mr. Sullivan and his colleagues. And so the New York Times should be liable for that, for running that ad, an ad that it was paid handsomely for. And the Supreme Court said in a critical decision for, it's a foundational decision for modern publishing, that no, the New York Times was not liable for publishing with respect to this potentially defamatory material about a public official, unless it could be shown to have done it with actual malice. And that standard was so high and reduced the specter of liability and allowed this kind of speech to occur. And the concern was, if the standard were lower, then anytime someone is offering to take up an ad like this, you are going to be very leery of taking up an ad that complains about these public officials because of the possibility that you might get sued and have to pay handsomely to on the basis of that. And that same concern animates much of this. That is, if we now do it based on advertising, you are accepting money and therefore now you no longer have immunity. It's going to mean that people assume that advertising is just some kind of pernicious people doing pernicious things. But the newspaper people know as well as anyone that advertising is often, ordinary merchants, ordinary people, even politicians who are trying to promote themselves and make their presence known to the world. And we shouldn't, and if we had to fact check everything that every advertiser did with that level of scrutiny, you wouldn't be able to say very much in an ad.
Can I just add a little bit to my colleagues' remarks, all of which were excellent. I asked people who think, well, let's take away Section 230 for amplification. Let's take away Section 230 for advertising. What's your end game there? I think that the regulatory hubris is, well, that means that they'll do a better job amplifying, or they'll do a better job screening advertising. But we know that what's more likely happens, we'll just see less of it take place in the ecosystem altogether. If it creates liability, you can't manage that liability successfully, you do less of it. And so what does the world look like if we see less amplification? It looks a lot like imagining trying to navigate the world of just Google Docs and Dropbox links. That's the kind of thing that is non-amplified. But what we expect from most sites is actually give us some guidance, help us find what's the most popular content, help us find the stuff that is tailored to particular categories. That kind of guidance is essential for us to be able to navigate any particular service. And that's what we would see less of. And I question, is that really what people want? And similar with advertising. What happens if we have less advertising? Well, Google and Facebook will be sad, but smaller ad-supported services are simply going to get wiped out. They simply can't exist under that cost structure. So what happens? What's the counter move in that circumstance? We just are going to see the internet shrink because a lot of businesses that are doing work that we want them to do simply can't afford it without that liability protection. So, ask yourself, not what do you want to have happen, ask what will actually happen. I think we would start to question whether or not we really want to monkey with either.
We have a question here from Christy, who says, Twitter has filed a motion to dismiss a lawsuit from a minor who claims that the social media platform refused to remove child porn that featured him and another 13-year-old, citing its immunity under Section 230. How can we revise Section 230 so that knowing illegal content is up and not removing it and not using Section 230 as an excuse? This is a very specific instance here.
Well, I have to say, I'm skeptical about the underlying facts because there's no one at any of these companies that I have ever met who would not be as aghast as I am about that description, about that situation.
And it's regulated by federal criminal law, and 230 provides no immunity under federal criminal law.
Exactly. 230 has nothing to do with protecting a company for circulating child pornography. That is a criminal act, and 230 totally excludes that protection. So it's hard to imagine what the scenario is in real life.
Another question we have here is, I recently watched an investigative documentary on HBO about QAnon. It made me question why these anonymous and radical right-wing organizations emerged in the first place. Do you think that if monopolistic giants like Facebook were broken down and had more bipartisan ownership and competition, that it would allow for more legitimate platforms that are less radicalized for Republican beliefs to be communicated and discussed? That's a can of worms in a question there, but it's something that a lot of people are thinking about, and certainly it's at the heart of some of the calls to reform or change 230. What are your thoughts about that?
I'm going to take this one because I want to point out that, in fact, we've seen the major internet services decide in their editorial discretion to go ahead and affirmatively purge QAnon-related content. Now, we might say that they should have done it earlier. I would certainly be sympathetic to that. But they've made that choice. And some of the reform models to Section 230 would have actually stripped the major internet services of that choice. The whole point would be to say, you can't remove it because it might very well be lawful content. It's awful content, but it might nevertheless be lawful. And so Section 230 is the reason why we've seen internet services actually take a proactive stance against QAnon content. And that's something I celebrate and encourage them to do more of. So Section 230 is actually the solution in that case. It's the reason why we're seeing them fighting, the internet services fighting back. And notice that a reform mechanism on either side might actually lead to a different outcome that would not necessarily benefit us.
Can I pick up on that? Because one of the reforms that's proposed is to allow for civil rights claims. That is, to exclude civil rights. Remember, Daphne and Eric described the fact that, I think it's Daphne described the fact that federal criminal laws are excluded from the scope of 230 immunity. We can add to that, the proponents argue, to add civil rights claims. The problem is that civil rights claims aren't what you think they are. They include the claims of QAnon supporters that their civil rights are being violated when their speech is squelched. So basically, the existence of civil rights claims is not the vision of a 60s civil rights vision. It's civil rights is an assertion that you are being discriminated against on a variety of grounds, including your political views potentially, or potentially your membership as a white person, or as a white male, or as a man. All those are grounds for civil rights claims. And so white supremacists will argue that their civil rights are being violated, they are being discriminated against because of their whiteness.
Daphne, I'm wondering if you could just quickly take us through what some of the proposed reforms are right now, the things that may be coming down from the Biden administration or others in Congress.
Sure. So there were more than 20 bills introduced last year to amend CDA 230. So it's a little hard to make generalizations. And many of the bills introduced last year, especially toward the end of the year, were kind of political theater. You know, they had to do with Republican leaders wanting to go along with what President Trump was asking for vis-a-vis CDA 230. And toward the end, he was bringing up CDA 230 as a topic at political rallies and tweeting about it all the time, which is part of the reason why it is so high profile right now. So I'll set aside the ones that I think are largely theatrical. There are some things out there like the PACT Act is the approach broadly that I find most promising, although I think it has a lot of devil in the details. But that's an approach that would say, look, we as Congress are not going to tell you platforms what your speech rules should be, but we are going to say you need processes in place to be clear with users what the speech rules are, to grant them appeals if you take things down, to issue transparency reports, various procedural rules around platforms' voluntary removals under their terms of service. And then separately, for speech that is illegal, it creates a mechanism, at least for some legal claims, for people to go to court, get a judge to say, yeah, this actually is illegal. And then the person takes that court order to the platform and says, okay, now you take it down. And this is a model that exists in a number of countries around the world that some courts have said is in fact what their constitutions require, rather than putting the onus of legal judgment on a platform to always put it on a court in the case of disputes about speech, or to usually put it on a court in the case of disputes about speech. I don't think it's a bad model. That said, we have a lot of problems already with people bringing forged court orders to platforms to get them to take things down under the current system. And we would see a whole lot more of these forged court orders, or orders that were issued without a genuine adversarial process and that really are silencing lawful speech under a rule that said, hey, this is the mechanism to get things off the internet if you don't like them. So that's one of the big models. A number of the other ones are, as Eric mentioned, or sorry, Anupam mentioned, taking categories of claims and saying this category of claim can now be brought against platforms. There's no longer 230 immunity. So there's a bill that lists harassment claims and civil rights claims as examples. I think in many of those cases, it's just very poorly thought through, and in part for the reasons that Anupam identified, what the definition of these claims is going to be, like what are we opening the door to? And also, since opening that door inevitably will bring in a lot of false accusations, what are we going to do about that? Is there some mechanism that can be put in place, like notifying users when their content has been taken down so that they can challenge that decision, penalizing people who send bad faith accusations? You know, there's a bunch of things you can actually do, and none of these laws bother to do those things, which suggests to me, you know, not a very serious consideration of how content moderation and platform content removals work in practice.
Anupam, what type of regulation of 230 would you support?
Sure. So I think it's important. So there's a case involving Yelp and user reviews on Yelp, where Yelp gets an order from a court to take down what someone says is defamatory. And it's a default judgment, meaning that there's no actual merits decision in the case, but rather the person who made the negative statement about the person's practice doesn't show up in court. But Yelp, for some reason, decides to pursue that and not take down the offending material. I think that if there's a court order, the platform should take it down. So I was a little disappointed in that. That could have been an interpretation of Section 230. There was a dissent in the California Supreme Court by Justices Goodwin Liu and by Justice Cuellar, which were brilliant dissents in that case. And it was a brilliant opinion by the majority, which is Justice Tani Kantel Sakiue. But I think that there are ways to take those actions. I also want to go to a point that Eric has really pressed in his writing, which is the costs of defending a 230 claim. And as Daphne pointed out, a bad faith 230 claim. Imagine being a blogger or a small newspaper where you are faced with a claim that something that you did online violated someone's rights. It will cost you thousands and thousands of dollars to defend that claim. And what many people do is just settle, even if there isn't an actual substantial claim. And I think we need to figure out how to penalize, as the Daphne's word, those people bringing those kinds of bad faith claims, and reduce the costs, because it's, again, if we legislate with Google and Facebook in mind, I think we forget the fact that a lot of small companies live and die by the specter of litigation. And it can be ruinous to a small company, and we should have, maybe we limit those remedies to small companies. I'm fine with that, but if you bring these bad faith claims, you shouldn't be able to get away with extracting a settlement just because the small player doesn't have the resources to defend itself.
Eric, I'm wondering, are there any reforms to 230 that have been proposed or that you can imagine that you would support?
The proposals to date, no. And as Daphne mentioned, many of them were actually just ridiculous. They were a waste of taxpayer dollars, designed to send messages to constituents, but not actually to advance the discourse. But I'm going to make an aggressive statement here, which I think is now consistent with my personality on this call, that Section 230 might be the least worst outcome. Let me say what I mean by that. That if we make a reform that motivates more content removal, a bunch of things are going to happen. The services are going to incur higher upfront costs. They're going to be expected to do a better job of content moderation, maybe better than they can do, and they're going to face higher defense costs and actual litigated exposure. And so if we go that model, a bunch of bad things are going to happen. Now, if we require less content moderation, then the trolls and the spammers win. And that drives away any business model that those services might have. It drives away intelligent conversation. And I don't think we like that outcome either. And so Section 230 has problems, as any media policy does. But I think that those problems might be the least worst outcome. And what I mean by that is that it creates the opportunity for each internet service to figure out, what does my audience need? What can I do to cater to its unique needs? And some audiences need a heavy-handed curation. Other audiences need a relatively gentle hand. All audiences probably need some, and no audiences want 100% tightly controlled moderation. And so we have this range of outcomes that Section 230 enables. And though it has problems, if we change the dial in either direction, I think those are worse.
And Daphne, from your perspective, what are there reforms that you could imagine helping us in the way that we navigate through this world of the internet? If we were to do something to change 230, what would that look like?
So I'm going to kind of split the difference between Anupam and Eric here, because I am very sympathetic to arguments for using court orders as the basis for deciding what should come down. I'm also sympathetic to calls for transparency. There are real upsides to that. There would be even more upsides if that transparency allowed users to exercise meaningful choice and move to a different platform. Once they learned what they learned through transparency, but the remedies there lie in competition. But I worry so that's where I'm sort of more on Team Anupam. Where I'm more on Team Eric is I really worry what Congress will actually do given the pen to amend 230. You know, if we start going down the road toward whatever I think is the optimal new variant on 230, we will come out at the other end with something very, very different. And this is what happened the only time so far that Congress has amended CDA 230. They wound up at the end taking two different bills that didn't quite match and just like glomming them together and passing both of them and ignoring the objections of a lot of people in the affected community, which in that case was people in the commercial sex trade. It was a law regarding trafficking and prostitution. And now we find ourselves in a place where Elizabeth Warren and Ro Khanna and a number of other people in Congress are trying to pass a new law to investigate what went wrong with that one. To go and look at what the unintended consequences were for the affected communities that they didn't listen to in the first place. So, I worry that something like that will happen again if we open the door to it. And I worry that just will happen.
But that sounds like, it sounds like a lot of things that we could say about Congress, in that if left to their devices, they won't make necessarily great laws around that or environmental regulation or any number of other things. But that is the system that we have, right? I mean, that's the check on this, isn't it? That's the one that is available to us.
It is the one that is available to us, but I think this gets us back to the other part of Eric's point, which is, what are the things they could do that would be better? And I think that's a pretty narrow range. And I think the reason for that is precisely because CDA 230 threads this needle of saying, hey, platforms, you don't have to take stuff down, but you can. We're not going to penalize you if you get into the content moderation business. And it permits this range of platform practices that Eric describes, where users can opt for, a free-for-all on Reddit, or a very restricted conversation in the New York Times comments, or whatever. By contrast, if we look at other countries, and in particular, if we look at the European Union, they tried to, from the start, say platforms have to take down anything they know about that's illegal. So they had notice and takedown basically for every legal allegation, not just the copyright and a couple of other things that we have here. And you don't get any kind of legal protection as a platform if you are too actively involved in shaping in content moderation or in curation or in ranking. And that left platforms in Europe really in a bind. If you talk to people who are trying to operate small platforms, which there basically aren't any anymore, but they were afraid to try to curate and to try to engage in content moderation and try to do the things that users actually want and that most politicians actually want. For fear that in itself would create liability. It's really hard to get away from that problem, and CDA 230 did. It gives us both protections for lawful speech and protections for content moderation.
We've just about run out of time, and there's so much more that we could talk about, but I want to thank our guests, Daphne Keller, Anupam Chander, and Eric Goldman, for this enlightening conversation. If you got a chance to, there's an awful lot of interesting back and forth in the chat, and probably even some links to places that you can do more reading on this. I want to thank all of our panelists so much. Thanks for spending some time with us. And I also want to thank the Connecticut Foundation for Open Government, or CFOG, specifically Kate Farish, who did so much work to put this together, and to Bruce Potterman from the Connecticut Mirror, who did so much, as always, to put our events together. You can find out more at ctmirror.org/events. If you want to see this event in the future, it'll be up there on our YouTube channel. YouTube, just another one of those platforms that we were talking about before. I'll also say one other thing. I will use this time right now to ask you to support both of the organizations that made this possible. Both the Connecticut Foundation for Open Government and the Connecticut Mirror are nonprofit organizations, and they're both very responsible for raising the bar in the conversation that we have here in the state of Connecticut about open government, about freedom of speech, and also about policy and politics. Both organizations rely on your support to make sure that they can continue to do the work that they do. So check out both websites and try to make a donation if you can, because that is what keeps nonprofit agencies like ours alive and thriving. Thank you all so very much for spending some time with us. and I appreciate it. Have a good night. Be safe.